I'm fully aware that this video might make some people seriously question my credibility as a critic of most things horror, but this has to be said. The Five Nights at Freddy's series has gotten a lot more crap than it deserves, and the fourth game in particular is one of the best horror games of the past decade. No, really! If you haven't already stopped the video, thank you for hearing me out, but I do have a bunch of things I feel I have to cover before I get to the actual point of this video, which is, and I'll reiterate, that Five Nights at Freddy's 4 is an underappreciated masterpiece. Just a short warning though, I will be showing scenes containing jump scares. However, I've removed the sound in an attempt to make them less scary. There will be no other kind of jump scares apart from that, I promise. With that out of the way, let us begin with Part 1. Knowing your limitations. In 2013, artist Phil Hansen held a TED Talk where he spoke about how he started developing tremors in his hand while studying at art school. His response was to simply start holding his pen tighter, which only made the tremors worse and ultimately resulted in permanent nerve damage. Eventually, he could barely hold anything, let alone a pen. This was understandably devastating for him. He dropped out of art school, believing he wouldn't be able to make art ever again. But several years later, during a neurologist appointment, he was asked a very simple, but perhaps the single most important question of his whole career.
Why don't you just embrace the shake?
By switching from making his signature tiny dots into squiggly lines, and then evolving even beyond that, Phil was suddenly able to make art again. It wasn't the kind of art that he had originally envisioned doing, but by changing his approach and taking this new, unexplored path, he wasn't just doing something that was better for his own well-being. He was doing something that actually might have improved the quality of his art overall. I think about that phrase a lot. Embrace the shake. Throughout the years that I've been reviewing video games for various outlets in my home country of We Made More Than IKEA land, all too often I got my hands on games that were made by people who, like Phil Hansen, decided to hold the pen tighter rather than acknowledging their own limitations. A very recent example is the 2019 game Only After, a clear attempt to make a narrative-driven game in the style of Heavy Rain or Life is Strange. But it fails almost spectacularly because of awkward dialogues read by people who struggle to deliver them convincingly while portraying characters that look awful even when compared to games that were released 20 years ago. There is even a scene where a character has to interrupt their villain monologue to excuse how his seemingly French accent is actively ruining the monologue.
Lust. The same impulse that makes us forget our own morality. Of course, my accent is not the best to make it sound right, but I'm sure you get the idea.
Flaws can be kind of charming. They can inject some personality into a game, and even enhance the overall experience in some cases. But unless you're trying to make some kind of statement about game design by making something that deliberately feels uncomfortable or even straight up bad to play, it might be safer, and most importantly, better, to not risk making something awful by aiming higher than you're probably capable of reaching. This brings us to game developer, animator, writer, and man who will be responsible for my inevitable heart attack, Scott Cawthon. Scott's story is not too different from Phil Hansen's, except instead of making pointillistic art, Scott made low-budget films and video games aimed at children, often with a specifically Christian message. This was clearly something Scott enjoyed doing and believed in, because he made a lot of these, but all of them were financial failures. And it might not be too hard to see why. He wanted to keep going, but to support himself and his family, Scott had to take jobs in web design, computer programming, and even truck driving. He started to feel really depressed, and at one point mentioned that he was having thoughts of suicide to his doctor, which later resulted in his life insurance being revoked. Is that how it usually works in America? Fucking hell! Around this time, people were starting to take notice of one of Scott's games, Chipper & Sons Lumber Company. It wasn't being praised, though. Quite the opposite, in fact. It was ridiculed. Perhaps most notably by video game critic and YouTuber Jim Sterling, who had quite the sizable audience even back in 2014, when Scott tried to have the game published through Steam Greenlight, while that was still around. This could have been the final straw, but instead, this was when Scott had his Phil Hansen moment. His Embrace the Shake.
I'd made a family-friendly game about a beaver before, but it was criticized online. People said the main character looked like a scary animatronic. I went into a pretty deep depression and was ready to give up game making. Then something in me snapped, and I thought to myself that I bet I could make something a lot scarier than that.
His response to the critics was, of course, the very first Five Nights at Freddy's, or FNAF for short. And this game blew the fuck up. Thanks to games like Amnesia: The Dark Descent and Slender: The 8 Pages, the indie horror trend started to really take off during the first half of the 2010s. But it wasn't just because of the games themselves, but the people who played them. People loved watching Let's Players get scared shitless by spoopy video games. So much so that it boosted not only the careers of several video game developers, but also the careers of several YouTubers. And on the behalf of Sweden, I would like to say that we are terribly sorry about that. Five Nights at Freddy's was, and still is, a good game in its own right, but its success was probably mostly based on being released in the right place at the right time. Now, some people would probably say that Scott got a bit too excited about capitalizing on this success when he released Five Nights at Freddy's 2 the very same year, and 2 sequels to that the year after. I don't think that's entirely accurate though. Releasing several shorter and more concise games during a short amount of time had been Scott's MO long before FNAF. In 2014 alone, Scott made 19 games in total. Making that many games in just a single year sure sounds a little crazy when he could perhaps have made better games by doing fewer and longer ones. But I honestly think that this is another one of Scott's flaws as a game developer that he managed to turn into something good. Scott clearly didn't have much patience. When he was done with a game, he released it. He was an indie developer after all. He had no one else to answer to but himself. So why wait? And it wasn't like the FNAF sequels weren't unique enough to be their own games rather than DLC for the first one. They were all relatively short. No idea was used long enough to become boring or stale. You can claim that Scott milked the franchise, and maybe you're right to some extent. But he really did try to differentiate the games as much as he could. If not visually, then at least in how they felt to play. And even though the games became increasingly ambitious, there has been no third-person Resident Evil style FNAF game, no open-world exploration game. Because even to this day, Scott knows his own limitations. This part was, of course, written before Five Nights at Freddy's security breach was announced, which looks to be the first truly high-budget game in the series where you actually can explore freely. And while that is a pretty huge step, Scott isn't taking it alone. The game is being developed by both him and Steel Wool Studios, who previously worked on the VR title Five Nights at Freddy's Help Wanted. So it's less that Scott is overextending himself by not taking his limitations into account, and more that he now has the help to actually realize slightly bigger visions. But what are these games even about then? Well, I'll talk about that in Part 2. The story, and why I'm not gonna talk about it. As far as I'm concerned, this is the only thing you need to know about the plot of the Five Nights at Freddy's games. You play as various people working at various locations owned by the brand Freddy Fazbear, where Chuck E. Cheese-inspired animatronics are out to murder you. It's as simple as the game's mechanics. Or at least it should have been, maybe. The backstory and lore might be the only aspect of the Five Nights at Freddy's franchise that I would consider calling bad. Or maybe just badly handled. The world Scott has built is an interesting one, but it's muddled by what is clearly a laying the tracks while the train is moving approach to world building. That's not an approach that is guaranteed to end in failure. Adjusting the course of a story based on fan feedback can actually take it into new and exciting places. But if you don't have at least a general idea of what you're doing, you could end up with something like the TV series Lost. And Lost actually has a very big thing in common with Five Nights at Freddy's. Just stay with me here.
In 2008,
series creator J.J. Abrams held a TED Talk about what he calls the mystery box, which is kind of the basis for Abrams' whole approach to storytelling even today. Essentially, the mystery box philosophy is about mysteries sometimes being more important than knowledge. And while there is definitely some truth to that, building a whole story around feeding more and more mysteries that the audience keep being told are gonna be solved at some point requires the existence of some thought out answers. Or as Game of Thrones author George R.R. Martin put it,
if you've planned your book that the butler did it, and then you read on the internet that someone's figured out that the butler did it, and you suddenly change it midstream and it was the chambermaid who did it, then you screw up the whole book. Because you got this foreshadowing early on and you got these clues you've planted. Now they're dead ends. You have to introduce other clues and you're retconning. It's a mess. I decided I would stay off the fan sites and let those be for the fans, the readers. Let them argue their theories, whether they're right, whether they're wrong. But I don't need to know about that.
Scott, on the other hand, did not stay off the fan sites. Or the YouTube channels in this case. Had he not been very open about that, it would still have been pretty obvious after playing Five Nights at Freddy's 4, where Scott put in a literal J.J. Abrams style mystery box. And while talking about the box in an interview with YouTuber Dawko, Scott actually admits to doing that exact kind of butler chambermaid switcheroo.
I watch all the game theory videos, and you know, me and Matt Pat have sometimes had an antagonistic relationship back and forth. I inconvenience him with my games, but sometimes he inconveniences me with his theories. But it's all in good fun. But I'll tell you, he made a video on that box, and he said that he thinks the contents of the box changed over the years. I bet nobody gave that a whole lot of thought, but I saw that and I was like, he's absolutely right. What I was intending the game to be when it happened, and then after the reaction of it, I was like, I need to craft this into something better for the people who see it as important.
Scott's dedication and love for his fans is truly admirable, but at times it comes at the cost of the quality of his games. Everything Scott releases becomes a mystery to be solved. And while that makes the games really engaging for some, it makes them almost Kingdom Hearts levels of incomprehensible for others. You know it's bad when people have literally built careers out of trying to understand and explain FNAF to people. So many characters and events have been retroactively made canon that I honestly can't tell you what the games were actually about in the end. And even if I play every single game to the end, I would still miss out on important lore that's only told in the books or at the bottom of a breakfast cereal. The story in the Five Nights at Freddy's series is honestly less of a story and more of a marketing tool. I don't think that Scott is so cynical that he doesn't care about the story, but one of the biggest reasons why people keep coming back to these games, and why people keep making theory videos about them, is because Scott keeps feeding his audience these breadcrumbs and teasing about a big picture that is constantly changing or that doesn't exist at all. But complaints about the story aren't the ones FNAF is getting the most. That would be part 3, jump scares. I think a lot of people have become so allergic to this term alone that they've forgotten what it actually means in practice. Jump scares are one of the most commonly used techniques in visual horror media, and it's without a doubt the one that's received the most criticism throughout the years. Too often, it's simply called lazy, a cheap way to get a reaction out of the audience by simply throwing a scary image straight into their faces, followed by a loud noise. And yes, bad jump scares and even an abundance of jump scares are actual issues that some horror media suffer from. But claiming that jump scares are just bad in general is completely false. And I think I need to talk about why that is to illustrate one of the major reasons why the Five Nights at Freddy's games, and the fourth one in particular, are so bloody effective as horror games. The basic FNAF gameplay loop is that you're sitting in a room with 2 or more entrances, and the only way of stopping the murder-happy animatronics from coming through those entrances is by localizing them with the security cameras and lock the doors when they're close. The goal is simply to survive the increasingly difficult 5 nights. If you do that without failing, you won't even see a single jump scare, or at least not in the first 2 games. But you will fail, many times. The closer you get to that 5th night, the more aggressive the animatronics become. That you will be jump scared more than once is an inevitable fact. But no matter how many times you play, you will probably not know when it will happen. Because it's entirely dependent on mistakes you don't know you're gonna make. Maybe you locked the door for too long and lost power. Maybe you unknowingly stared at security footage while one of the animatronics stealthily snuck into the room. The tension of not knowing if you've fucked up, not knowing if this is the time you'll make it, that is what makes Five Nights at Freddy's both exhilarating and extremely stressful. The effectiveness of a jump scare isn't about the jump scare itself, but the moments leading up to it. Some of you might have forgotten that I promised that there wouldn't be any proper jump scares in this video, but others might have been expecting and dreading one anyway. That is what it's actually all about. The jump scare isn't the sentence, it's the exclamation mark. It's a jolt of horror, but it's also a relief. There really was a monster in your closet, but now it's gone until you decide to try again. Maybe you'll eventually get used to the jump scares, but that's not a problem exclusive to Five Nights at Freddy's. That's all horror games, if we're even gonna call it a problem. Think about your favorite horror game. Is it still as scary as when you played it the first time? Probably not. Regardless if you've learned to master and maybe even exploit the game's mechanics to make the struggle easier, or if you've simply seen the threat so many times that it's lost its original scariness, every horror game will eventually not scare you anymore. It's like being told a joke you've already heard before. You can still appreciate it and remember why it made you laugh so hard in the first place, but it won't surprise you. And surprise is perhaps equally important in comedy and horror. I don't think that diminishes the horror though. Instead, I think it just makes you look at a work with a different pair of glasses. You start asking questions like, why was the game scary? How did it scare me? And if it was a good horror experience, you'll probably have an even bigger appreciation of the craft that went behind it all. So if you stop being scared by the jump scares in FNAF, or if you were never scared at all, that's fine. Because there is a lot more to these games than the eventual jump scares. And especially in one of them. Part 4. Why we are really here. This might be the right time to tell you all that I've never actually played a Five Nights at Freddy's game to the end. Not even the game that I'm about to completely gush over for the remainder of this video. Not because I didn't want to or because I didn't try, but because, for me, these are the scariest video games I have ever played. Not even my favorite horror games of all time has made me so reluctant to actually play them. I'm pretty certain that this isn't a very popular opinion, but then again, I'm not here to tell you to be scared by a video game that doesn't scare you. I'm here to talk about my own experience, and to make you put on that other pair of glasses to, hopefully, appreciate the craft behind Five Nights at Freddy's 4 as I have. When I played this game for the very first time, I made sure to do it during the most perfect circumstance for playing horror games. My girlfriend at the time was out. So was our roommate. The apartment was completely empty. I sat down on the living room couch with just a single light source coming from the floor lamp next to me. I put my headphones on, and then I started the game. And then I turned that game right the fuck off. I don't have a background in music theory, so I can't exactly explain why, but this music, it's one of the most dread-inducing menu themes I've ever heard in a video game, or in anything. It sounds like the actual fucking apocalypse. It's so sad, and at the same time it's this slow and growing bombardment of some of the most unnerving noises. This music sends a very clear message. If you thought the other games were scary, you haven't seen anything yet. And it manages to convey that message so effectively, in less than its 52-second runtime. I also feel that it's worth mentioning that I originally didn't play this game on a PC. I owned a MacBook at the time, which FNAF 4 wasn't available on. So when I sat there alone in that mostly dark apartment, I was about to play FNAF 4 on my smartphone, and it was still too scary for me to play. When you actually get beyond the main menu, you'll soon notice the two biggest changes from the previous games: location and movement. You're no longer a restaurant security guard who literally puts their life on the line just to get by. You're a kid inside your dimly lit bedroom. And since there's no longer a desk to be glued to, you can actually move around with relative freedom. You just click on one of the spots the game lets you investigate: the closet, the bed, or one of the two doors, and the kid runs over there. Before, it was the animatronics who ran up to you. Now, it's actually you who have to run up and get close to them. If you don't go and check the bed, a small group of Freddy-like nightmare plushies will attack you from behind. If you don't check the closet, the animatronic Foxy will eventually become sentient and attack you from the front. And if you don't check the doors, well,
I'm sure you get the idea.
it's really frantic and really weird, like a nightmare. And even though it doesn't take too long to just start rolling with the dream logic of it all, it never stops being stressful, but also exciting. And probably it will still be exciting if you eventually get used to the scares. But why do you even play as this kid? And why are there killer animatronics inside their house? Well, as per usual with the story in the Five Nights at Freddy's games, it's not very clear. But it honestly doesn't matter too much. You're a kid who is so afraid of these animatronics that they have deadly night terrors about them. And for me, I feel that's enough to be thoroughly engaged. The story that truly matters in any Five Nights at Freddy's game is, after all, your own. How you will make it through it all. The choice of protagonist offers an interesting new perspective though. Like in Among the Sleep, the age and more importantly the mindset of the character you're playing as alter the look and feel of the world they inhabit. In Among the Sleep, something as innocent as a raincoat can look like a tall and threatening boogeyman, because you're playing as a 2-year-old who doesn't know any better. In FNAF 4, you're presumably playing inside the nightmare of a kid, where the animatronics that scare them during the day transform into twisted monstrosities with an almost comically huge amount of razor-sharp teeth. And that might just come off as overly designed and goofy for an adult who's playing this, but mostly you don't see these designs up close before it's too late. And I mean, Amnesia: The Dark Descent, which is often called one of the scariest video games of all time, managed to scare the crap out of people with this absolutely ridiculous thing. So, if there's a persistent theme in Five Nights at Freddy's 4, it's lack of sight. Which I guess you could say about a lot of horror games. They're usually not very bright. But FNAF 4 isn't just a dark game. It actively uses that darkness against you in some clever and spooky ways. And at times it forces you to rely more on your ears and guts than on your eyes. Firstly, unlike in the previous games, there are no security cameras, so there are no ways of knowing exactly where the animatronics are, except when they're right in front of you. Even in horror games where you have no other means of defense than hiding, you at least feel like you have a smidge of control. Yeah, you might not know where the monster is lurking, but you can potentially hide in a closet or a locker for as long as you like, and be relatively certain that it will not find you until you make an attempt to press on. In FNAF 4, there are no hiding spots, and without knowing the location of your closest threat, not a second of gameplay goes by without you feeling completely exposed and helpless. Secondly, when you run over to any part of the room, the camera tilts down to the floor. When you already have a hard time seeing or knowing where the animatronics are, giving up even more of your sight when moving from one part of the room to another is chilling as hell. Even if it's just for a second, even if it's safe, it feels like anything and everything can happen during the time you're looking away. So when you arrive at a spot and you look up, there is always that fear that something that you definitely don't want to see will be looking back at you. And finally, those two doors on the left and right side of the room, those doors are literally the best doors in horror games. Even better than those good old Resident Evil ones. Hell, you can quote me on that and put it on the Steam page. If I had to point out the single scariest part of Five Nights at Freddy's 4, it's this. When you reach one of these doors, you can use your flashlight to look for any of the animatronics who are walking around outside of the bedroom. If they're far away, they will immediately be spooked by the flash and run away. If you use the flashlight when they're close by, you're dead. The only way to know if there's an animatronic on the other side of the door is to open it without turning on the flashlight and listen for what can only be described as breathing. In other words, you have to look into complete darkness while a thing that can kill you in an instant if you make as much as a single mistake is standing right in front of you. That scenario is one of the scariest goddamn things I've ever experienced in a video game. Even when I was just watching, while 3 other people were playing it in a lit up room during a charity stream I was hosting in 2019, I was sometimes having a really hard time just looking at the screen, because I was genuinely scared of what might happen. And when I was replaying the game for this video, I was spending a lot more time looking down at the floor than on the game.
I'm just checking my socks for holes.
You aren't wearing any socks.
I've been a fan of horror games since I was around 13 years old. They don't have that effect on me anymore. But somehow, Five Nights at Freddy's 4 does. That alone makes it very special for me. But you won't be finding Five Nights at Freddy's 4 on any best horror games of all time or best horror games of the 2010s lists. It got some positive reviews. But by the time the FNAF 4 was released, I believe a lot of players and critics alike saw the franchise as less of a series of video games and more as a tool for YouTube Let's Players to create lucrative content. The franchise was still popular, but barely any of the major video game websites bothered to review any of the FNAF games after the first one, and definitely not the fourth one. Today, it feels like the games only existed during an isolated point in time, and then almost completely vanished from any serious horror-related discourse afterwards. But now, the dust has cleared. That original wave of seemingly endless Five Nights at Freddy's content has come and gone. Aside from talking about how fantastic Five Nights at Freddy's 4 is, I kinda wanna put the whole series back into the critical analysis spotlight now that we can talk about the games without just talking about their relationship to the people who played them. Because I personally believe that there's a lot more to say about these games, and I would love to see different takes than what the fucking timeline looks like. Part 5. Conclusion. When I say that Five Nights at Freddy's 4 is specifically a masterpiece, I think I should clarify what I mean by that. A masterpiece, to me, is not a perfect video game, because that simply doesn't exist. And it's not a game I think that most people, or even just a lot of people, agree is a perfect one, because that doesn't interest me. For me, it's hard to pin down a single definition of what a masterpiece is supposed to be. But one way I define it is a game that's been made by someone who has managed to master their own personal craft. Someone who has not only mastered their strengths as a game developer, but more importantly, their weaknesses. British author and journalist J.K. Chesterton once said that art consists of limitation. The most beautiful part of every picture is the frame. Since Mr. Chesterton died in 1936, I'm pretty sure he wasn't referring to Five Nights at Freddy's 4, but I think this quote encapsulates just why this game is so good. The very first Five Nights at Freddy's was born out of limitations. Five Nights at Freddy's 4 was then made when Scott Cawthon seemed to be so comfortable working within those limitations that he knew how to make the scariest possible version of his original concept. Video game sequels tend to add more and more as time goes on, but Five Nights at Freddy's 4 went for less, and it worked amazingly. The story is a bit easier to grasp than in the previous games, but it's still part of a very confusing whole. And sadly, it might be close to impossible to play this game for those who have severe or profound hearing loss. But overall, it's an incredibly effective horror game that shows the power of simplicity. If you've watched this video and thought that none of this looked particularly scary at all, I implore you to try playing FNAF 4 yourself, preferably with headphones, in the dark, without company. Because the difference between watching these games and playing them is like night and day. This truly great video game would never have been made though, if it weren't for how Scott Cawthon expertly handled criticism. When people started saying harsh things about Chipper and Sons, Scott could easily have gone deeper and deeper into his depression, hurting himself, or he could have lashed out at his critics, hurting them back. But ultimately, he decided to not see it as the end of his time as a creator of kids games, but as the beginning of something new. That is really inspiring to me personally, and I feel that a lot of video game developers and content creators in general should look to Scott Cawthon for inspiration. Far from everyone is gonna be as financially successful as Scott, but we can all learn how to learn from our creative failings, dare to limit ourselves, and make something that we perhaps never planned on making, but that we can be proud of. Or, as Phil Hance's neurologist once said, embrace the shake. Thank you so much for watching. This video would not have been made if it weren't for the lovely and generous people who support me on Patreon. And I want to give a special thanks to Nichtschwert, Sindri Orben, Tobias Mattsson, Håvard Krugerud, Professor Flowers, Winders, Philip Kirschner, Oddshrew, and Mackenzie Pollock. If you want your name to be read at the end of these videos, and if you want to help me afford better recording equipment than an iPhone taped to a tripod, you can support me on Patreon as well. Not only do you get to see my videos earlier than everybody else, you also get access to the Discord server. I also want to give a huge thanks to Hates Vadim and Pixel a Day. I don't really understand how I'm able to get all of these amazing people to agree to do voices for my videos, but like, holy shit, do these people do great work. If you haven't checked them out already, then please do. Right now. For God's sake. This video took a bit longer to make than usual. I moved recently and university is really eating up a huge chunk of my time, but I really hope it was worth the wait, because this is a video that I have wanted to make for a really long time. And please, even if you don't really find the games very interesting, at least give Five Nights at Freddy's 4 a try, and come back when you do and tell me what you thought about it. Anyway, that's it for now, I guess. See you later.
Oh, Jesus.
Loopers!
Fuck me!